Welcome to the Orange County Forum, where newsmakers keep you informed about local, national, and global issues that impact Orange County today.
Hello, everybody. We're going to get started. I'd like to thank you all for coming. My name is Tom Berg. I'm a reporter with the Orange County Register. And would like to thank the Orange County Forum for inviting us here today. And I'd like to thank you for coming. Around the fall of Saigon, approximately 50,000 Vietnamese ended up coming and landing in Camp Pendleton. And they were living in tents down in Camp Pendleton. They lost everything, right? They lost their homes. A lot had lost families. They're in a new land where they really couldn't speak the language very well. They were living in tents, and they couldn't leave until someone sponsored them. And it's amazing when you think that 40 years later, what's happened. You know, we might not see it. It's like you can't see the forest for the trees. But in 4 decades, this group of refugees has created the largest enclave of Vietnamese outside of the nation of Vietnam and the Vietnamese Cultural Center of the United States. And so we want to talk a little bit about how did they do that and what is all around us today. What is Little Saigon, and how would you define it?
I think one thing I might comment on is the way that it is, despite the ambitions, I think, of the US government in the 1970s as it's resettling these Vietnamese refugees, the idea was to spread them out, to minimize their impact, and that this would hasten their assimilation or integration. And yet, Vietnamese refugees said, no, we want to live where we want to live. So there's a really interesting pattern of secondary migration. So Vietnamese are moving to Orange County and creating this community that wasn't supposed to be. And I think that that's kind of remarkable in that they kind of ran against those policies.
And I would actually add to that, you know, we know that the emergence of Little Saigon, at least on a very formal level, and its official recognition happened in the 1980s. But as early as 1975, we have an article by our UC Irvine campus newspaper, The New U, or the New University, in May of 1975, as that first wave, or the first cohort of evacuees that had come from Southeast Asia, were at Camp Pendleton. A journalist, a student reporter, and a photographer came down from UC Irvine, and they wrote this nice article about how if you ask, you know, a spectator, or you asked your ordinary American where to find Little Saigon off the 5 freeway, they would say that you were smoking something, right? But in fact, that was the unofficial nickname given to areas in Camp Pendleton where Vietnamese were, you know, already starting to establish the social networks that they would need and would rely on to build their communities thereafter.
Yeah, and I think also the history of how Little Saigon came about as a formal term that was designated for this community is really fascinating. There was a lot of advocacy from the community to get this sign put on the freeway, the 22 freeway, if you go into Little Saigon, right? Next exit, Little Saigon. And it was the former governor of California, Duke Majan, that officially designated this area. But I think there's a lot of history behind how this community came to this particular area. And Thuy mentioned Camp Pendleton. There were actually 4 different camps set up in the US when the first refugees came over. One was in Camp Pendleton in California, San Diego. One was in Florida at Fort Eglin Air Force Base. Another was in Arkansas, Fort Chaffee. And the 4th was actually in Pennsylvania at Fort Indiantown Gap. And so the idea behind this was to disperse the refugees so that there wouldn't be any ethnic ghettos formed in any particular area of the country, and to reduce the burden, right, on any particular areas. But like Allison was saying, this secondary migration occurred because, well, California, you have great weather, right? Who doesn't want to be in California? And job opportunities. I think that was another area that really attracted a lot of refugees to this area. And so we had this development of Little Saigon.
Not everyone here may know the full story of the immigration of Vietnamese to the United States. Can you lay out for us these different waves? And maybe even the interaction of the waves which contribute to the success of Little Saigon. So someone can jump in here, but you know, in 75 we had, I believe, about 125 to 150,000 immigrants. And then what happens later, and how does that foster the growth of Little Saigon?
I can take that question. I teach Vietnamese communities in the U.S. at Cal State Fullerton, so a lot of, depending on who you ask, I think a lot of people will organize the waves into usually three main waves. Those who left right after the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, like Thuy said, were more well-established, had connections to the American government, and so they were able to get out earlier. And then the boat people, or the refugees that we often see represented in the media, those left in 1977 towards the early 1980s. And those refugees didn't have as many resources or connections. Some of them were put into re-education camps after the communists took over. And so when they were released, they organized these escapes. Many of them also included ethnic-based Chinese living in Vietnam at that time who had the resources, fishing boats. A lot of these boat people left on fishing boats, and they were able to get out and escape as a result of that. You also had to have money. You had to pay for these boat trips. Not anyone could escape. And so oftentimes you see families splitting up. They would perhaps send the father or the oldest child to go first with the hopes that they would reach a third country and sponsor the rest of the family over. But we know that they estimate anywhere from 1 to 2 million people escaped by boat, and perhaps 50% of those people died on the high seas. And so it was a very treacherous journey, but many people took that risk because they didn't see any other way out. And then there's the third wave of refugees who came over as a result of family reunification policies that were set up in the early 1980s and going on into the 90s and even today, 2000s.
There's a momentum that builds off each other, like a symbiosis here. Can you describe a little bit of that and how that really builds Little Saigon? I mean, there are Little Saigons all over the country, but there are none as big or as old as the one in Orange County. So explain how that worked a little bit, please.
I think part of it is, and I'm stressing the ways in which there are kind of particular but also kind of universal themes in this history, and that is that these are kind of refugees who are, and we'll talk about the trauma, who are not expecting that they'll be able to return, right? And I think that that creates a sense of place and the necessity of kind of belonging and building community that kind of translates into the success of Little Saigon.
And I would add on to that a much longer history of displacement that Vietnamese had experienced even prior to entering the United States. In 1954, when Vietnam was partitioned at the 17th parallel, about 1 million North Vietnamese came down south. So they came down to South Vietnam. Many of them were Catholic, many of them would be persecuted by the communist regime. So the history of displacement is quite embedded in the community. And then of course, in the refugee waves, those who left and made it here were the successful ones, right? So it's almost like this kind of parsing out of the folks who were able to make the journey in the first place, had the resources, the money, the connections, and then actually arrive here. And so in that way, I think all of that contributes to building the infrastructure for a successful Little Saigon community.
Yeah, I would agree. And historically, right, we also, if you go back 10 years before the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, in 1965, there was the 1965 Immigration Reform Act, which totally changed the immigration history for many groups, European immigrants as well as immigrants from Asia. And this program basically set up a system for certain refugees and certain immigrants to be accepted into the US. And a lot of it was based on occupational categories. If you had certain skills, right, that the US was looking for at that time. This was during the Civil Rights Movement. And we wanted to be portrayed to the rest of the world that we're the land of the free. And so President Kennedy and then later on President Johnson signed this act into law because we wanted to accept, right, immigrants into the country. And later on in the 1970s and 80s, much of that act facilitated a lot of family reunifications. And so if you were the spouse of a citizen, if you were children, it had certain mechanisms in place for these people to come over. And so I think the refugees, as a result of the Vietnam War, benefited greatly from these policies that were already in place. And when the first refugees came over in 1980, the Refugee Act actually set up parameters to get refugees on their feet. And so they had 36 months of welfare, for example, right? And they were able to make it because they had a lot of support. They had sponsors that were able to take them in and basically provide for them food, shelter, right? All these mechanisms that were in place because of these policies.
So you're saying that there's several factors here. We have some programs in place to help. We have this history of dealing with change, and we have Little Saigon set up. Is it fair to say that this wave of American immigrants to America, have they assimilated faster than past waves? How do they compare, say, to past waves that we think of in America? How are they similar and how are they different? And is it quicker, or is that just our imagination because the world runs quicker?
Yeah, that's hard to measure, right? Because the world is different, and this is a community that did have certain kind of resources, had a distinctive history of displacement, but they definitely relied upon those kind of ethnic and cultural ties, and I think that that has been a long-standing tradition in U.S. history, whether you're looking at Irish, Mexican, or Italian immigrants. I think kind of Vietnamese, like Mexican immigrants, and I connect those because the immigration is continuous. And if you think about some of those earlier groups where you have a wave and then that wave is interrupted by immigration restriction, right? And that kind of cuts off. But here you see kind of the renewal and the replenishment, I think, of Vietnamese culture and maybe some of those kind of generational kind of tensions as well as commonalities.
Any other thoughts here on this?
I would definitely agree with that, and the only thing I would add is just in thinking about the variations or in comparing and contrasting to other immigrant groups. The refugee narrative is actually what is so vital to this community's sense of identity and its placemaking. So I think that that's the way in which Vietnamese have been compared to Cuban refugees in Miami, right? As this stronghold that's been able to solidify a lot of political power in a relatively short amount of time because of something that glues them together, right? And to me, I think that refugee identity is a very strong kind of a glue. It's a super glue, right? It's, this is, and it'll be tied into hopefully our later discussion about trauma and how that continues to impact the community.
Well, let's talk about that, yeah. Someone described it to me that trauma is part of the narrative of this wave of immigrants from Vietnam. Is that the case? And if so, what does that mean?
I think trauma is something that is definitely a part of this refugee experience. And I come from a public health background. My PhD is in public health from UCLA, and I gravitated towards studying mental health issues in the refugee community. And if you look at not only the Vietnamese, but also there are Cambodian, Lao, Hmong refugees who were affected by this war. We have the largest Cambodian community in Long Beach, right? Outside of Cambodia here. There's many numbers of Lao in Fresno, Minnesota, for example. The Hmong population in Minnesota is one of the highest anywhere. And so you have these very unique communities that have formed throughout the US, and for many of them, what ties them together is this sense of trauma, right? That they experience not only during the war and before the war, but after the war, right? Having gone through all of that and having gone through all that loss, to come here to America and basically trying to deal with that trauma, some of them not having the resource to be able to do that. And so you have things like the protest in Little Saigon, where you had mentioned the video store owner who hung up a picture of Ho Chi Minh, and it sparked 53 days of protest in Little Saigon. And it's when you look at that from the outside, you think, oh my gosh, how can someone protest for 53 days over something that may seem inconsequential, right?
And what's the answer?
But I think that it goes back to that issue of trauma, and people are trying to deal with this in a very big community-wide way of storytelling, right? It was an opportunity for a lot of people to say, when the fall of Saigon happened, right, it's not just about down with the communists and this anti-communism fervor, but it's about, like you said, my uncle died in the re-education camp, or my mom lost her life at, on the high seas. There's all these stories that
comes out as down with communism.
Right, exactly.
Does that create an issue with the generations? Where the first generation came, they witnessed the horror. They lost family members. They lost their homes. They lost everything. The kids, they don't relate to it. It's what I think of it as is, like, I interviewed a lot of World War II veterans over the years, in men and women who were at Pearl Harbor. They say, we can never forget. They lived it. They saw it. And like with me, I get it on a cerebral level, but I don't feel it the way they do. And I think there's a similar thing going on with the parents that came here and saw the horrors of war and saw the horrors of trying to get here, and the kids who live a pretty good life now. How does that generational split, how does the new, well, maybe you could start off by telling us, what is a 1.5 generation? Because I heard that term a lot. I don't know what it means. And what is the second generation? Where are we at? And how does the new generation see life different from the first generation?
That's quite a loaded question, but let me try to pick it apart in pieces. So the generation, what's 1.5, what's first? Obviously, the first generation are those who came here, experienced the war firsthand. Well, we're talking about Vietnamese Americans specifically, right? And they've had to come here and adapt and remake their lives. Their children, they might be anywhere. And the 1.5 is this really kind of ambiguous category. Some people define it as those who were teenagers when they got here, but others, like myself, who came when I was 5 years old, also identify as 1.5 because of my retention of the language and the affiliations that I have with the community's history and memory. And the second generation are American-born. So they're Vietnamese who are born in the United States, born and raised here. And what we're seeing is an emerging third generation now. So that's kind of where we're at. And that really ties into many other communities' histories. For instance, the Jewish community, the Holocaust survivors, the Japanese community, internees who have those memories. It takes about 30 to 40 years before these memories can really surface and be a point of conversation in families. And so what we're seeing as our community, Vietnamese Americans, at that very pivotal moment, when so many who are the first-hand witnesses, those who experienced the wars, those who experienced the displacements from the wars, they are now at a point where they're passing away, and their children are trying to make sense of that. And there's a lot of, there's a scholar who talks about post-memory, when she talks about the way it reverberates in the second generation. Those who, like myself, I was born well after the war. Not well after, shortly after the war had ended. That's me trying to fool myself. But I was born after the war ended, so I have no real tangible connection or memories to that war, but my father was a South Vietnamese soldier. And these are not stories that are shared directly in a lot of Vietnamese American homes, because if you think about it logically, right, the space of the home, it's incompatible with these stories. So when would you ever talk about experience of seeing your comrade in arms shot, or your uncle, drowning at sea, your sister? And so these are stories that we're now collecting. Actually, since 2011, UC Irvine has the Vietnamese American Oral History Project. I was the first project director, and it's still going on. We have over 300 full oral histories of Vietnamese Americans in Southern California. And you can access that database via our UCI libraries site that we've built. So you can hear right now over 160 stories. And these are stories of perseverance and resilience and survival.
More trauma. I mean, how do they reconcile that? Like, if you went through the horrors of war or the horrors of a boat person experience, and your child just sees it as this abstract thing, like a history book, some of the things that I've heard is that some of the parents want the children to, take Vietnamese language classes so they can retain the culture. And there's also, at least in the past, been great debate about whether it's okay to return to Vietnam or not, too. But what are the ways in which these families reconcile these huge differences in outlook on life?
Yeah, I would think that there's no single strategy or single response. I mean, in some ways, I think parents might read their children's separation from that trauma as a sign of their success, of their Americanization, right? That they have kind of protected them. I think others might kind of resent the loss of that culture, that heritage, that memory. And I think when you talked about kind of Japanese Americans, I think there's also this opportunity for the latest generation to step up and talk on their kind of, grandparents' behalf or their parents' behalf because they have that distance, right? So I think there's those choices.
On the topic, I know some of you specialize in some issues of trauma, and there was the Amerasian, which is a very unique situation. Tell us a little bit about that, Allison, and the rest can weigh in on some of these issues.
Sure.
With children, unaccompanied children coming to the United States.
Right, absolutely. And I was thinking of kind of current, very heated debates about what Americans' obligations are to children who are crossing the U.S.-Mexican border, mostly originating from Central America. And part of my work has looked at children who were adopted by American families or children who were sent by their Vietnamese families with the hopes that they might reunite in the United States if they were lucky enough to get out on one of those later waves. A lot of these children did have American fathers or suspect they have American fathers, and the United States did try to make amends in its words and assume responsibility through the Amerasian Homecoming Act passed in 1987 that kind of hurried some of this family reconciliation. And there was kind of trauma and loss, but also cases of reconciliation and reunion that they kind of balance out the story.
I think we're also, as a country, as a nation, we're trying to reconcile with this history still, right? There's an exhibit right now that's going on up in San Francisco at the Presidio on Operation Baby Lift, and it opened on April 17th, and it'll be going on until December 31st. But so out of the, in 1975, there was an Operation Baby Lift, which took about 2,000 children from Vietnam into the United States, and about 1,500 of them passed through the Presidio, and that's from there they were kind of sent out to be sponsored or adopted by American families. So that exhibit is going, and it's trying to really kind of, I think a lot of these ways in which we try to reconcile with the past is trying to figure out, at least, I mean, as I've observed in the Vietnamese community, asking a really crucial question, which is, what are the memories that we can live with? And then how do we move on from those memories, right, as traumatic as they may be? And so, talking about it, dialoguing, exhibiting these stories, sharing these stories so that those that live around us, our neighbors, our friends, people we work with, can also understand some of these histories as well.
Did you want to talk a little bit about health issues? I know you specialize in some of that.
Yeah, I think coming from a public health background, I think that a lot of the trauma that refugees experience, it's not easily expressed, obviously, right? And I see now as a professor teaching at the college level, a lot of those children of those refugees coming into my classes, wanting to learn more about their history. And I actually assign an assignment where I have them go and interview someone from their family or in the community to talk about this history, because like Thuy said, it's very hard to broach this subject at the dinner table, right? Mom, what happened? And so I think this gives them an excuse to be able to learn about that history. And as the second, third generation grows up and assimilates into American society, I think there's more of that need for searching for that identity, right? How do you operate in these two cultures, sometimes multi-cultures. And if you go into Little Saigon nowadays, you see Korean restaurants. The people cooking the food in the restaurants are usually Mexican, for example. And so there's a lot of blending of different cultures, and I think there's this need, right, for these up-and-coming generations to learn more about how do we coexist in this society, this multicultural society, this diverse society. And I'm really heartened to see projects like the Vietnamese American Oral History Project, the Southeast Asian Archives. At Fullerton, we're starting a BA program in Vietnamese studies, and we have Vietnamese language classes, like you were saying. A lot of schools have these programs because there is that need out there. And I think that a part of that need is for different people to learn about each other, right? To learn about how do we coexist in this society? How do we get along? How do we work together to build up our communities? So I think that's part of it.
I'd like to just touch briefly on the politics. If you could maybe describe what have the politics been, and what are they becoming, and what is the importance of having, say, a Vietnamese American on the city council or on the board of supervisors? Like, what is the importance of it, and where is it at today?
I have a real quick answer to that, which is
That's what we like, real quick.
I think it's fantastic to see Vietnamese American political leaders, and we've really seen, over a dozen currently political leaders in this county alone. But I think it's less important that they are Vietnamese American and more important that they understand Vietnamese American issues, the community, its history. So that to me is a lot more important, and there are certainly resources that you can seek to understand those histories.
Yeah, and I would just say, anti-communism has been the conventional political language that kind of Vietnamese refugees have spoken to get heard and because of their experience. But I think because of generational change, I think there's newer vocabularies that are being embraced.
Yeah, related to that, I mean, my research before I came to the archive was I got my doctorate at UC San Diego in ethnic studies, and I wrote a dissertation on anti-communism as a cultural politics. And the way that I came to understand it is, and I'm really adopting a political scientist named John Harles, who looks at Laotian refugees, and he comes up with this really nice term to describe what he sees as a politics of the lifeboat, which is one that's about refugees who arrive at this country already embedded in this narrative of indebtedness, right? That needing to demonstrate that we belong and are worthy of being here and being citizens of this country. And that politics really circumscribes what we're able to say about ourselves in the public sphere. So anti-communism has been that engine and that vehicle in the past 40 years for Vietnamese Americans to be heard. I read it as an opportunity to really share stories, right? And it really, to me, it comes down to a question of history and memory. Where are the spaces that we can write our stories, and how do we seize the tools to write those histories? And anti-communism has been quite a divisive way to do that. And I would love for us to look for ways to expand beyond that, think about different ways of engaging our history and being more inclusive of Vietnamese American, because as in, we see the waves, newer arrivals from Vietnam who have a very different historical reality, right? Having been educated in Vietnam, where the refugee history is not taught at all, and that's problematic too, and we can certainly rectify it by teaching it here to them. But right, they're a part of our community too, and we also have to reconcile with these boundaries that we've set up around Vietnamese America.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. A round of applause, please, for them.
The Orange County Forum is brought to you through the generous support of the Orange County Register and our sustaining partners. For more information about the Orange County Forum, call 949-588-9884. The Orange County Forum is a nonprofit organization. Your contributions are tax deductible.